Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. I'm Murray Rundus, the production manager and editor here at Catholic Family News, and I'm very happy to be joined by Phillip Campbell. Phillip is a great writer for Catholic Family News. He writes a number of articles for us. Almost every month, he's written an article for us, and he's also written a number of books. He's been on Catholic Family News, this video show before, and he also has a great blog, Unum Sanctum Catholicum, which you see on the bottom of his tag there. And, Phillip, we wanted to have you on because there's been a lot of controversy recently about this Mayan Rite. Originally, Michael Haynes for LifeSite News came out with a report. It sort of blew up after that. Our editor-in-chief made a video about this, and we got a lot of massive response, really asking different questions about this. There was a number of pro-Francis pontificate publications that came out with defenses for the Mayan Rite, ranging everything from, this is nonsense, this doesn't exist, to calling people racist. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we wanted to have you on because you wrote an excellent response on your blog to some of these claims. And we wanted to really dive in more for this because we want the traditionalist movement to really be rigorous in this regard. So maybe for our audience to begin, Phillip, could you give us some background? What exactly is this Mayan Rite that everybody is talking about, and how is it different from the Novus Ordo or the Tridentine Rite?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me back again, Murray. And yeah, I'm really happy to dive into this. And before we do, I just want to mention to your listeners, I've been sick. I've been under the weather. My voice is kind of shot. So if I sound a little off, that's why. I'll do the best I can, though. So that being said, what is the Mayan Rite? So what is being called the Mayan Rite is essentially just the Novus Ordo with some adaptations that are drawn from indigenous customs of southern Mexico. It's really the Novus Ordo with a few elements added into the mix. And when you look at it this way, the name Mayan Rite is really kind of a misnomer. As I pointed out in my article, this was a name that was coined by Spanish language media outlets and later adopted by Catholic outlets. So when, for example, where Peter is accusing traditionalists of stirring up controversy by even calling it the Mayan Rite, which is not its technical name. This wasn't even something traditionalists came up with. This was what the Spanish language media was calling it. There is actually no official title for these changes. If you read the documents, they simply call them indigenous liturgical adaptations, which, gosh, sounds about as bureaucratic as you could possibly come up with. But on November 29th, the bishops of Mexico issued a clarification that there is no such thing as the Mayan Rite because this had turned into such a kerfluffle. And this is a bit of an equivocation. We can discuss that later. For the sake of conversation, we're still going to say Mayan Rite because it's easier than indigenous liturgical customs. But we should keep in mind that nobody is actually claiming that this is a new rite of the church. And the word Mayan, strictly speaking, refers to the language group common in southern Mexico, not the ancient Mayan religion. Now, that doesn't mean that the adaptations aren't related to Mayan religion, of course, which is what we need to talk about, only that the name itself isn't meant to refer to this. So if we want to go strictly by, the technicalities of what this is, it's basically just the Novus Ordo with some local indigenous adaptations tagged onto it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that raises the question because, and look, there's been a lot of these sort of adaptations made. We've talked about on the show before the various Australian Aboriginal adaptations, and same thing with the Zaire Use. Well, we might even mention that later. But how long has this particular project been in existence, and how long have these various bishops and the people behind this? How long have they been at this?
For a surprisingly long time. I mean, most of us only heard about the Mayan Rite beginning about last year, maybe about early 2023. But from what we can tell, this project was set in motion back in 2013, almost as soon as Francis took power. The prime mover in this was and is Cardinal Felipe Arizmendi, who at that time was the bishop of the Diocese of San Cristobal de las Casas, which is in the extreme south of Mexico in the state of Chiapas. Erismendi met with Francis only 10 months into the pontificate to start to push for these indigenous adaptations, including a missal in the Tzatalan language. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. I'm not fluent in Spanish, but the Tzatalan language, which is a group of languages spoken in the Chiapas region. And if reports are to be believed, they were also pushing for a permanent diaconate where deacons' wives were given a sort of quasi-ministerial role. This was not approved. The Vatican did not approve the deacons' wives' role. This actually had been, that part of it had been pushed way back into the pontificate of Benedict the 16th. This area of southern Mexico has always been kind of a hotbed of experimentation. Pope Francis in particular seems to view Latin America as like the laboratory where a lot of these adaptations or experiments can be tried out. We know that he's very, when he refers to the peripheries, right, he's thinking of places like the Amazon Basin or Chiapas, the Diocese of San Cristobal de las Casas, where there's large degrees of indigenous Catholics, but that are still very attached to pre-Christian kind of cultural customs. So I think Francis views this whole area as like a laboratory for experimentation. That's how it's been used even before Francis's pontificate. Now, we first got news of something like a Mayan Rite, as far as I can tell, back in 2023. That's when the rumors started leaking that the Mayan Rite was on the horizon. Now, Erismendi is still the principal spokesman for these adaptations, even though he's no longer the bishop of the diocese. He's retired. We should also mention Bishop Rodrigo Aguilar, who is the current ordinary of San Cristobal de la Casa. He's the one that would be in charge of actually implementing these adaptations. Now, as far as who they are meant for, they're intended for the Tzatalan-speaking peoples of the state of Chiapas, which is the most indigenous of all the Mexican states, I believe. And I've got the details and the demographics in my blog article, which is called "Responding to Some Predictable Schlock About the Mayan Rite." If you want to look that up on Unam Sanctam. But from what I recall, Chiapas is about 60% indigenous, so it's the most indigenous of any Mexican state. Now, allegedly, there were a number of indigenous peoples who are not conversant in Spanish, to whom this would be a boon. But as I document in my article, the number of persons in this region not conversant in Spanish is very low. It's something in the range of 9% of the population is not conversant in Spanish, and that's primarily among the older generations. So if you look at the demographics, and I cite this all in the article, Mexico tracks this stuff. There's organizations that track, the prevalence of indigenous languages. They are shrinking. So that's 9% maybe among the older generations. So it's shrinking every year as you move down to the older or the younger demographics. So it's a very, very small sliver of people that aren't conversant in Spanish, but allegedly this is the population that these adaptations are meant for.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe to really just dive into the adaptations themselves and the sort of the details surrounding it. There are 3 elements I've noticed that traditionalists often go to. And, this is something we covered when we made a TikTok video and an Instagram coverage, just trying to get this out, get the news out there. And here are the 3 elements that really I've seen. One is the dancing in the liturgy. The second is females using some sort of Mayan bowl as a special incensing role. Another is the liturgical division between president and principal, with lay people leading some parts of the mass. So my question is, well, are these accusations true, or is this just misinformation? We had a lot of commenters quoting that Where Peter Is article that you mentioned, and also the Mexican bishop's response saying, this is just misinformation. It's completely not true. What do you have to say to that? Are they correct in their criticism of the traditionalist points?
Those 3 points you mentioned are the adaptations that made it into the final document, and that's not with any spin. That's without any commentary. That's simply what the document says. Now, there has been some misinformation on this due to the gossip that was circulating before the document was issued versus what the document actually said. So when we go back like a year or more to when this was just kind of something that was being heard through the grapevine, There was talk of things like a Mayan altar, praying in 4 directions, the deacons' wives having a ministerial role, as I mentioned. Most of this stuff did not make it into the final document, at least under those names. And then there was other stuff that did make it into the document, but not the way it was originally discussed. For example, the dance. There was a dance performed by members of the congregation after like right after the consecration of communion. You can see videos of this. That ended up making it into the adaptations, but moved to different places. So it's no longer immediately after the consecration. Now it's during the offertory, or it's as a Thanksgiving after communion. So yeah, there was a lot of confusion because there was a lot of stuff being discussed that didn't actually make it into the adaptations. But as far as what you just read, that's absolutely in the adaptations. So let's review the actual adaptations, which are 3. Number 1, now you mentioned the division of the liturgy into having a president, a principal. So you have like the celebrant, who is the priest, or the presider, as the Novus Ordo likes to call them. But now we also have an office of the principal, which is a respected layman in the community, who is his job is to invite the congregation to pray aloud at certain points and lead them in prayer. He kind of functions as a liturgical narrator, if you will. Now, this isn't, I'm trying to be fair. This isn't completely unheard of in our religion. For example, you see this sometimes in the Chaldean Rite. For example, there will be like a chief server who has a microphone off to the side, and he will say responses aloud, speaking alternately to the priest or congregation. So, for example, in the traditional Latin Mass, we have the servers say their responses collectively, and they say them silently, or at least, only audible to the priest, right? In other rites, you will have kind of a server who stands out as like a narrator and says things out loud in a microphone, kind of leading the congregation. So if I'm being fair, this isn't entirely unprecedented, but it is unprecedented in the historical Latin Rite as far as I am aware. So unprecedented in the Latin Rite. and this is where people were worried about praying in the 4 directions, because earlier drafts of these adaptations said that the principal, if he wants, can pray in the 4 cardinal directions. Now, the adaptations do not allow him to, he's not praying to pagan gods or something, but this is clearly a ritual that comes from paganism, which we can talk about. But I should specify, the current adaptations do not say that the principal is supposed to pray in the 4 principal directions. That's actually just not mentioned. This is one of those things that was like talked about, but didn't make it into the final document. As to whether that will be permitted or not, it remains to be seen, but when we're talking about the Novus Ordo, what is permitted is kind of like, that's a jello concept, The second issue is the female ministry of incenser. This is a woman who offers incense before the altar, generally from a bowl, sometimes with her head pressed against the altar. Now, this was something that the deacons' wives were doing, and I think is the obvious selection for this, given the context of what's going on. If you watch videos of these masses, you'll often see the deacons processing in as a couple with their wife, almost suggesting she has a quasi-liturgical function. The Vatican did put the kibosh on saying the deacons' wives had any special ministry. They were doing something, for example, where when the deacons were ordained, the deacon's wife would lay her hands on the deacon during the ordination ceremony. And that was put an end to. But they're still practically functioning as if the deacon's wife has a quasi-ministerial role, right? So this is something they do, offering incense with a bowl. Now, this is where there was concerns about the Mayan altar, because it talks about gifts that are able to be laid at the foot of the altar. Now, the actual adaptations do not call for a Mayan altar, but LifeSite News, their opinion is that the Mayan altar is still there, just not under that name, because the concept of the Mayan altar is basically, it's a location in the sanctuary where kind of like gifts of food and like grain and things like that can be set down, right? And the adaptations do allow this to be set down in front of the altar, right? So even though there's no Mayan altar by name, some people say that this is the Mayan altar. Now, I will say, okay, I can see where you're coming from on that. There is also other traditions of setting stuff before the altar, though. And honestly, in Latin America, you already have lots of other altars, like for example, the Day of the Dead altars, right? With the little skull. Those are straight up called altars. So I definitely see where LifeSite's critique is coming from. I guess, I don't know. I don't think any of this stuff needs to be happening at all. So when you're splitting hairs about is this the actual Mayan altar or not, it's like, okay, fine, but we're talking about a bunch of women processing up with incense bowls, pressing their head to the altar. Like, what even is this? But anyhow, that's the second adaptation. The third one is the ritual dance, which can take place at the offertory during the prayers of the faithful or Thanksgiving after communion. Now, I've watched some videos of this dancing, and it's kind of like a slow rhythmic swaying of the hips while they perform a series of synchronized turns. There can be an accompaniment of guitar or maracas or other such instruments. The bishops of Mexico, you're familiar with this statement. They said it's not a dance, it's more like a swaying. From my perspective, and I'm just a stupid layman, but that's really an equivocation. Like, what's the difference between a dance and a gentle swaying? Like, if I'm slow dancing with a woman, isn't that just gentle swaying, Or if I'm doing a waltz, isn't that just swaying and turning? They're like, oh, it's not a dance, it's swaying and turning. To me, that's an equivocation. They're doing it to music, they're swaying, they're turning their bodies, whatever. We can split hairs about it. But what the bishops of Mexico know is that the concept of introducing liturgical dance sounds very bad. And so they're trying to say this isn't a dance, it's just swaying. I think probably what's more accurate to say is this isn't an animated dance. Let's put it that way. This is not an animated, energetic dance. It's a slow, rhythmic sway with synchronized turns. I'd say it's a dance, but it's not like a vibrant, energetic dance, and that's what they're trying to go for. So that's the reality of what the adaptations are. This is right in the document and from the words of Cardinal Arizmendi. As far as traditionalist misinformation goes, Mike Lewis of Where Peter Is, he accuses us of spreading misinformation. I don't think this is fair. There is a general consensus on what's going on. The debate is it's not around what's happening. It's around what these adaptations mean and where they come from. For example, we all agree that the adaptations allow women a special liturgical role to offer incense before the altar. That's not misinformation. That's simply one of the adaptations. The question is whether this is a pagan custom, or even more fundamentally, I guess, even if it's not a pagan custom, does it belong in the Roman Rite? That's really where this question comes from. So I don't think there's traditionalist misinformation. I'm sure there's trads out there, as always, that are running with things a little too far, as trads are wont to do at times. But everything you said is not misinformation. That's simply what the adaptations are.
Well, yeah, Philip, I must say I was very perplexed because when we put out even that short video, that many people were just saying all of those 3 points were misinformation. They were completely false. And I think anybody that's really seriously taking this into account is going to have to take a different direction when it comes to defending it. And they're going to have to go and look at some different precedents. And as you mentioned, they're going to have to look at the meaning of it. And, you talked about you mentioned one of the defenses that you often hear with this, which is saying, well, one of the more unserious ones is saying, well, the Catholic Church has, over 20 different rites of the church. This is just another one of them. And, the Ukrainians can do what they do with the Liturgy of John Chrysostom. I myself go to the Liturgy of John Chrysostom frequently. It's beautiful. But as you said, this Mayan Rite is not properly speaking a rite. It's an adaptation of the Roman Rite. Now, this can be a confusing thing in and of itself because, of course, the Western Church has different rites that I think often confuse people. There's the Ambrosian, the Mozarabic,
Yep.
the Dominican, and all these things are very similar to the Roman Rite. But I wanted to ask you, how is the Mayan Rite, properly speaking, a part of the Roman Rite? Is this just another expression of the Roman Rite, like one of the Mozarabic and Ambrosian? And really, to sort of go on that as well, how can that be reconciled with the latest statement saying that, well, the Novus Ordo is the unique expression of the Roman Rite?
If there's one phrase I think I'm sick of, and that all trads are probably sick of, it's the phrase expression of the Roman Rite. As if the Roman Rite is like this completely amorphous, abstract idea that has many different expressions because we somehow can't capture its essence. I don't know. These Mayan adaptations, it's still squarely within the Novus Ordo lineage, so it's really just a variant of the Novus Ordo. I mean, really, the question comes back to whether the Novus Ordo is the Roman Rite. That's the real issue, because if it is, if the Novus Ordo is the Roman Rite, then the Mayan adaptations are a subvariant of the Roman Rite also. Now, I think most traditionalists do not consider the Novus Ordo to be the historic Roman Rite. I certainly don't. And just to clarify, that's not to say it's not a valid liturgy, you haters, right? It's not to call into question the sacraments. But when we're talking about the historic Roman Rite, we're talking about a strict formal continuity with the elements of the historical Roman Rite. The Novus Ordo deviates from those considerably, and then the Mayan adaptations deviate even more. So it's like a copy of a copy, right? Now, of course, you can have different families of liturgies within the Latin tradition that are not the Roman Rite. The Roman Rite was, of course, the liturgy as said in the city of Rome. But as you mentioned, you also have the Ambrosian Rite, the Mozarabic Rite, which were part of the Latin family along with the Roman Rite, but they were nevertheless distinct from it. And even within the Roman Rite, or the Roman Rite, you can have various uses, which are like smaller regional variants. So you had the Zaire Use, which was the Roman Rite as adapted in the Diocese of Salisbury in England. It was very popular in southern England. You have the use of Esztergom, which was the Hungarian variant of the Roman Rite. Now, there's a lot of debate sometimes about what constitutes a use versus a rite. Some people will speak of the Dominican liturgy as a use of the Roman Rite, while others will speak of it as a distinct rite. They'll just call it the Dominican Rite. If you go to the Dominican Friars website, I was trying to look I actually, I mean, I'm not a liturgist, so I don't know all the answers to this. But I was like, what's the status of the Dominican ritual? So I went to Dominican Friars website, and they actually don't even clarify. They call it a cousin of the Roman Rite, whatever that is. So I can't get too detailed on that question. But the point is, there's always been variation in the Latin family of liturgies, even within the Roman Rite. But these things have always developed very organically, right? They've developed very slowly over time as the liturgy takes root in a different culture. What you don't see in history before the modern period is people being like, you know what we need? We need a new use. Let's get a committee together. We'll just draw up a use and come up with something. It doesn't really happen that way. It was much more organic. It's just kind of like, Murray, like, you know, over time, as you grew up, you were a child and you grew taller, right? But there was no point in your growth where you sat down and you said, you know what, tomorrow I'm going to grow 3 inches. And you like just decided you're going to grow, you know. The liturgy has always kind of spread organically. And so it's very different than what we see today, where everything's kind of become bureaucratized. But this brings us back to like what constitutes the Roman Rite to begin with. And this is a matter of debate. Some people speak of 9 essential elements of the Roman Rite. Others speak of more. I've heard as many as 14. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to just repeat the list that Dr. Kwasniewski makes use of in his book, The Once and Future Roman Rite, where he offers 9 fundamentals of the historic Roman Rite, which are the Roman canon, the use of Latin, Gregorian chant, the lectionary, the calendar, the offertory prayers, the ad orientem stance. the parallelism of liturgical action, which is like the congregation doing one thing while the priest is doing parallel actions, and then the separate communion of the priest. Now, it's possible to do the Novus Ordo in a way that incorporates some of these elements, but not all of them. So this is why many people suggest the Novus Ordo cannot be considered to be the historic Roman Rite. Now, as for the indigenous adaptations, they don't really pertain to this one way or another. From a liturgical point of view, they're just another variant of Novus Ordo filler that has no grounding in the Roman Rite. So if you think of all the stuff we've seen in the Novus Ordo that's not found in the history of the Roman Rite, whether you talk about communion in the hand or the use of vernacular or anything you've seen in Novus Ordo that's not the Roman Rite, liturgically speaking, these adaptations are just adding a few more things to that bucket list of stuff that we've seen that doesn't pertain to the historic Roman Rite.
Yeah, and I often find it very tiresome whenever this comes up, you get people saying, "Well, there's the Dominican Rite." Look, I have had the great opportunity to serve Father Albert's Dominican Rite when he says it, and look, that's an average onlooker is going to say that's the traditional Latin Mass. You have slight changes, but
Yeah.
it's certainly not drastic changes that would
No.
change it in this way. Now, to look at a separate precedent and one that I wouldn't dare defend, because I think, as you mentioned, a lot of ever since the Novus Ordo's production and its takeover of the Western Church, I think a lot of the things coming out of that have been awful. And one of these things, though, that we do have to mention is the Zaire Use, or the Zaire Rite. I've heard one called both ways. This is what some people have used as precedent. Now, they go about it in a way that I certainly don't defend. They'll say this is Pope Benedict did this. Pope John Paul II was in the works. They're traditional, are they not? I don't believe they are, but that's the defenses they used. Is this that different from the Zaire Rite?
Well, yes and no. I guess one thing we should say to frame this conversation is this kind of all hinges on the Novus Ordo itself. So if you think that if you think that the entire, let's just say what goes on in most Catholic churches around the world in the Novus Ordo, if you think that that's acceptable, then within that framework, the Zaire and Mayan adaptations are both acceptable as well. Like, you have no grounds for approving all of the liturgical reforms of the 60s and how they've been implemented and the changes Pope Francis has made, for example, and then turning around and saying, well, I oppose the Mayan Rite. So if you grant the framework of the Novus Ordo, then the Mayan Rite logically flows from it, right? But if you don't, then it doesn't. Now, the Zaire Rite, unlike the Mayan adaptations, the Zaire Rite is actually a distinctive use, okay? So we talked at the beginning how there is no Mayan Rite. It's just a figure of speech. It's not even a use. It's just a couple adaptations to the Novus Ordo. The Zaire Rite was constructed as a distinctive use. So it has a lot more variations. It's more of its own thing, whereas the Mayan adaptations are simply just the Novus Ordo, as said in like Chiapas. So the Zaire Rite was approved for use in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which used to be called Zaire. The origin of the Zaire Use actually goes back to before the Second Vatican Council, to the Franciscan missionaries there, who created something called the Missa Luba. Now, the Missa Luba was simply the traditional Latin Mass set to Congolese melodies, okay? So all the texts were the same, the prayers were the same, the structure of the Mass was the same. There was no indigenous rituals introduced into the Missa Luba. It was simply the traditional Latin Mass set to Congolese melodies, right? Instead of Gregorian chant. So I guess what we could say is that instead of Gregorian chant, they're putting in traditional Congolese music. Now, after Vatican II, with all the excitement about enculturation and openness to the world, etc., this momentum grew to take the Missa Luba and build a liturgy, an entire use around Congolese customs. And that's how we got the Zaire Rite in 1988. Now, if we're going to compare the Mayan adaptations to the Zaire Rite, there's some similarities. Both have a principle. Now, in the Zaire Rite, this fella is called the announcer, right? I mentioned before that the principle functions as like a narrator. So in the Zaire Rite, this is called the announcer. They both do have a dance element, but overall, the Zaire Rite actually has more adaptations. So in the Zaire Rite, the calendar of saints has actually been altered. The penitential act has been moved to after the homily, and there's many more congregational responses. So in the Zaire Rite, the whole thing is more of a like a call and response. The laity are directed to raise their arms during the Our Father, and they sit during the gospel reading. So instead of standing at the gospel, they sit down. Also, whereas the dance in the Mayan Rite is more of, like I said, a slow rhythmic swaying, in the Zaire Use, the dancing's much more energetic. It's much more like vivacious, right? Now, perhaps the biggest variation you see in the Zaire Rite is the invocation of ancestors. So when they petition, when they do the invocation of the saints, there's a phrase where they invoke, and this is a quote, the ancestors of upright heart, who are invoked along with the saints. Now, normies really seem to like the Zaire Rite, as you mentioned. It's constantly held up as an example of enculturation done correctly. But from a traditionalist perspective, I'd say the Zaire Rite is vastly more troubling than the new Mayan adaptations. In the Zaire Rite, you actually have, you actually have a different calendar. You have, like I said, the invocation of ancestors, many more adaptations. So I think the Zaire Rite is actually more troubling than the Mayan Rite is.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's it's really interesting to think about, because I think if the Zaire Rite was put forward in the Francis pontificate, I think we'd hear no end when it comes to, it would be,
Oh yeah,
the whole church is apostatized, et
yeah.
cetera, et cetera. But I mean, that shows that this problem is before the Francis pontificate, and that's something we all have to take honestly and really consider, that this is something that goes back long before the Francis pontificate. So
Yeah, and we have to remember, and I've pointed this out many, many times over the years on my blog, is that Benedict XVI was not a traditionalist, not the way we understand traditionalist. He didn't want the restoration of the Latin Mass. He wanted the freedom of the Latin Mass for what he thought of as mutual enrichment.
mhm.
So he wanted the Latin Mass to be free, and he wanted the reverence of the traditional Mass to influence how the Novus Ordo was said. But he also wanted that influence to go both ways, right? He spoke of mutual enrichment between the two expressions of the Roman Rite. So he also was hoping that things from the Novus Ordo would influence how the Latin Mass was said. And thank God we never got to that in Benedict's pontificate. I don't know what he was imagining. But, Benedict was not about just restoring the traditional Mass. He was about some kind of mutual enrichment. I mean, I think, and I don't want to dive into Benedict's liturgical vision, but Benedict really had almost like a dialectical view of the liturgy, with kind of like liturgical changes producing reactions, producing other reactions. And eventually we'd get to this synthesis. We'd get to this Hegelian synthesis where the best of the traditional Latin Mass and the best of the Novus Ordo kind of fused into this elusive Mass of Vatican II, the Mass that the Council wanted, right? Mm-hmm. So the Zaire Use was part of this vision, and I think, prudentially it was the wrong call. But you're right. People tend to give Benedict XVI more of a pass on these things that he did. If Francis had created the Zaire Rite, people be losing their minds. But it was like applauded when Benedict created. And you could still see the normie conservatives, like the George Weigel sort of crowd, still like applauding, like, oh, the Zaire Rite, it's like enculturation done correctly. It's like, no, they're literally invoking their ancestors, but whatever. That's a whole other topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot more to be said on Pope Benedict XVI. And I know some people would critique, look, it's not a Hegelian thing, it's more of a Guardinian thing. But I think at the end of the day, most people that are looking back with a nostalgic vision of the past with Pope Benedict the 16th, I don't think they're being really honest with his vision. As you mentioned, it was not a traditionalist, let's get back to the Latin Mass, but that mutual enrichment instead. But, with all of this being said, if somebody came to this point and was like, okay, this is actually happening, this is not misinformation, and this is its own thing. It's a unique thing. It's similar to the Zaire Use, but it's its own thing. It's its own adaptations. I want to look at what those people might say once we've reached that point. And something that I've seen a lot of people say is, well, this is the church in the past has adapted pagan elements. We've seen this with various titles, architecture in the church. But the church has certainly done it. Goodness, Christmas is coming up. We always face the Saturnalia controversy or the Christmas tree controversy that always comes up. So are these adaptations pagan? And if they are, is that, per se, a bad thing? It delegitimizes it. When can the Roman Rite use these pagan adaptations?
Well, it's a tough question because I pointed this out in my article, like pagan is just a loaded term because it depends on what people mean by pagan. So, for example, are we talking about a custom that once was pagan but has long since lost its pagan connotations? For example, like the names of the days of the week, right? Thursday is the day sacred to the god Thor. But obviously that pagan connotation is so far gone that it's completely innocuous, right? Like it's completely secularized, right? Or maybe we mean something that is currently practiced by pagans, but it's innocent enough to be utilized in a Christian context. For example, pagans burn incense, right? But burning incense is kind of innocuous and general enough that Christians also do it. It's a Christian custom to burn incense. It's a pagan custom to burn incense, right? So you have pagan customs like that. Or are we talking about something that originated in paganism, but it can be logically detached from its pagan context, but it's still very closely associated with paganism, such that there's a real danger by proximity? For example, yoga, right? Yoga emerged out of pagan religion, and it's very closely associated with pagan religion. But it's true that you can logically be like, oh, no, it's just some stretches and breathing, and I can detach that from its spiritual aspects. And that might be technically true, but it's still very close to paganism by proximity, to the point that most Catholics would probably feel uncomfortable incorporating yoga into our, worship, right? Or are we talking about something that's simply irredeemably pagan and constitutes full-blown pagan worship and superstition, like, I don't know, astrology, right? Or something like that. So this is where people get muddled when we're talking about, are the adaptations pagan? Because there's really like at least 4 different definitions for what you could mean by that. Similarly, like when people say, is Christmas pagan? Like, what do you mean by that exactly? So there is a bit of nuance here. Now, I will say, and it's my personal opinion, I do not believe the adaptations are pagan in the last sense. That is, I don't think these people are actively worshiping false gods in the middle of the Catholic liturgy. And just because something is indigenous doesn't mean it's pagan. For example, the role of the principal, this reflects not pagan worship, but indigenous tribal structure. And you can find similar customs in European tradition where like a chieftain or a lord had special privileges in the liturgy. For example, in medieval England, the lord or the patron of the parish, he got to sit inside the chancel, whereas the rest of the congregation had to sit outside the rood screen. But the lord got to sit inside of it. So he had a special role in the... Now, granted, that wasn't a ministry per se, obviously. But my point is he had special privileges. And such cultural traditions can find their way into worship over time. A good example of this is the disappearance of the congregation praying in the orans posture. So if you look at ancient Christian art, you'll see that regular Christians are depicted praying like this, right, in the orans posture. But that was a posture that gradually went extinct and was replaced by praying with hands folded. which was an adaptation from Germanic tribal culture as a sign of submission. Now, but see, that's extra liturgical. The rite does not specifically say we have to fold. The rite didn't say we're going to enculturate German customs now, so now we're going to all fold our hands, right? This isn't something pertaining to the ritual per se. So, yes, cultural practices from the outside can and do find their way into the sanctuary, but these aren't specifically associated with pagan worship. Holding your hands like this was not a pagan ritual, right? Having the Lord sit inside the chancel wasn't something derived from pagan worship. And I think that's the central difference. You never see examples of people bringing once pagan customs into the liturgy itself. Yes, you see people being like, hey, the pagans made some nice architecture. Let's adopt that form, right? For the church, right? That's one thing, right? There's always a little bit of a give and take onto what customs can exist in Christian society. So we have to make a distinction between society and the liturgy, right? If you read the letter from Pope St. Gregory the Great to Miletus, who was a bishop that was going to join St. Augustine in England, and I have this letter cited in my blog article, he says, let the pagans keep their customs of their dances, let them keep the buildings, let them keep a lot of the cultural things that they used to do, shorn of their idols. But he doesn't say let them bring it into the mass. He says, he's basically talking about Christian society, not the liturgy. If you read the laws of Burgos, which are the laws promulgated under Emperor Charles V for how the Spaniards were to behave with the indigenous of the Americas, it says, let them keep their dances because this is a source of joy for them. Why should they be deprived of things that give them joy? Yeah, take away the idols, but let them keep the dances and all the customs. But it doesn't say do it during the Mass. So we have to make a distinction between Christian society. You have all sorts of customs that have been introduced to Christian society, right? But this discussion kind of stops at the doors of the liturgy. Now, some of these Mayan adaptations are clearly pagan in origin, and I think you have to be disingenuous, to deny it. For example, the women offering incense out of bowls. There is so much ample evidence of women in pagan indigenous culture in the Americas offering incense out of bowls that you'd have to be daft to say that that's not a pagan thing. Now, again, the question is this something that's universal enough or innocuous enough that it can be brought into the liturgy? Cardinal Arizmendi lauds this as an example of enculturation since it's an old indigenous custom. But, the question is, if it's an indigenous custom, what were the women offering incense to before, right? If you're admitting this is something the pagans do, well, what was the context of it? What were they offering that for exactly? Now, others have also reasonably surmised that the swaying and rotating is a survival of the custom of praying to the four cardinal directions. And I think that's a very reasonable take. These things aren't so far removed in the past that it can be completely shorn of its pagan connotations. And it doesn't really matter if they mean them in a pagan way. Like if you watch Michael Lofton's video on this, he talks about, well, they're not praying, they're not praying to the four directions, they're not praying to these gods. They don't mean it in a pagan way. At a certain point, it doesn't really matter. Like, this is kind of a very modern attitude, like, oh, what matters is my intention, like what I meant to do, not what I'm objectively doing, not the objective ritual I'm performing, And so does the objective ritual matter? Does the Roman Rite have objective content that is the Roman Rite and this other stuff is not? Like I said, if you accept that Novus Ordo paradigm, then all this stuff becomes acceptable. I honestly think we should revisit the Chinese rites controversy of the 17th and 18th centuries, which was precisely over these sort of questions where they asked, like, can we invoke our ancestors in a non-religious way or commemorate them? We can't go into that here, but this would be an interesting read to go back to that.
Yeah, definitely. We have an interesting interview with the Western Confucian Journal on this channel that delves into that slightly, evangelization to Chinese. And something I wanted to mention briefly is that, I think there's this myth that in order to evangelize these indigenous people, that we would have to bring these sort of enculturations in. And I think if you look at the statistics, we see Eastern Orthodoxy is growing in the Mexican regions. It's now of course they're schismatic, but it shows that the traditional liturgy is still attractive to many people. And I don't think those people need to be demeaned in that sort of sense. Now, I did want to bring up one thing
Yeah.
because we're talking about, in Christian culture and inside the mass. I've seen more sophisticated approaches to this. Bring up an article series that New Liturgical Movement did
Oh yeah.
on the
The Indian
Indian
masses.
masses that were done in North America. And I
Yeah.
wanted to ask very briefly, we've already touched on some of the principles involved, but these requiem masses in the book of the seven nations, and I'll link that in the description, the New Liturgical Movement series. How were those in so-called Indian masses different from this current Mayan adaptation?
Well, they're similar to the Missa Luba. So you're referring to the Native American masses. These are from like around 1860s, 1865, the Book of the Seven Nations. These are simply the traditional Latin Mass translated into Mohawk and Algonquin. So it's basically just the traditional Mass in the vernacular language. The ordinaries, the propers, all follow pretty closely to the Roman Rite, but they're just rendered in the native languages. There's no messing with the ritual. There's no introduction of indigenous customs. There's no question of introducing pagan practices. There's no adaptations really beyond just saying the Mass in the vernacular, which, of course, in 1865, that would have required, special authorization to do, right? Which is very different from what we have with the Mayan adaptations. So, I mean, I think the Book of the Seven Nations Requiems, you see a lot of that stuff in the see when this tends to happen is you get into mission territories where the culture is so far removed from the European or Mediterranean context of Christianity that that the Latin can become a real obstacle to them even understanding what the religion is about. So kind of on a temporary basis, the missionaries were allowed to translate and say the liturgy in the vernacular language, right? To as a means of catechesis. Obviously, in the idea that at some point, when they were catechized enough that they'd be able to partake in the normative Latin Mass. So that's very different from what we're seeing with the Mayan, just a different mindset entirely. I think if Cardinal Arizmendi was really concerned with the coherence of the Mass in Chiapas, then a translation of the Missal into the Tzatalan languages should have done the trick, which is something that's already allowed and encouraged in the post-conciliar church. So even by the Novus Ordo's own logic, there's really no necessity for these adaptations. I think they exist to just further the agenda of enculturation, but I would argue that the Native American masses of the Book of Seven Nations exemplify this in a much healthier way.
Yeah, and it goes back to that Novus Ordo mindset of that, adopting the sort of Protestant mindset of semper reformanda, right? Always reforming the church, and there's no end to it. Now,
Yeah.
Philip, I wanted to save the biggest critique that I've seen, and it's sort of the trump card that's
Oh yeah.
always played against the traditionalists. I want to save it for last, which, I say that sort of in a joking manner, but it is something that always these sort of biting small critiques do get some people. It does resonate with people, and it typically goes something like, "Well, typical traditionalist hypocrites. You're accepting pagan elements, like when you gleefully call the Pope Pontifex Maximus, which was talking about Bridge Builder, the pagan priest. You gleefully use that. You use this Roman pagan classical architecture. You praise that." but here you don't accept the Mayan adaptations. This shows a white-centeredness, this shows a racism and a hatred for the indigenous peoples, while you're just playing the superiority card when it comes to Western culture.
Yeah, when all else fails, call them a phobe and an ist, right?
Exactly.
Well, for one thing, I hate it when white people do it too. Like, have they not saw how trads respond to like white boomer masses, like boomer Novus Ordo masses? Like, like it's not like trads only critique, masses by non-white people. I mean, for heaven's sakes, where have they been for the past 20 years of the traditionalist movement, watching us post cringe videos of European and American Novus Ordos and, pile on the white boomers for what they're doing, obviously. But so a couple points. Number one, you can't. Okay, first point, the fact that the liturgy had things introduced into it in the past is no argument that it needs to have stuff introduced to it now, because the liturgy doesn't grow at a continuous kind of rate throughout time. It's an organic reality. It's kind of like a tree. When a tree is very young, you can bend it and shape it and move the tree. You can actually bend the branches and get them to grow in different ways. But as the tree grows up, you can no longer do that because it's taken on a definitive form, and you can't do that without breaking it. When the liturgy was still in a more formative stage, say in the 3rd century, there was more things that were being introduced. There was more changes that were happening because it was young. And that's just the nature of how it is, right? And you can't just you can't just deny the organic nature of the liturgy. So the fact that something happened, that Pope Gregory the Great decided to move the Our Father to the position it is now, that doesn't mean that Pope Francis should ergo just feel free to move the Our Father to a different place, because after all, Gregory did it 1,500 years ago, right? The liturgy, you expect the changes to get smaller as time goes on, but that's just common sense. But the specific stuff like classical architecture, gosh, that's so broad, right? Like, that's like saying the church can't use bricks because the pharaohs used bricks to build their pagan pyramids. Like, checkmate, trads, right? Pontifex Maximus literally just means the great pontiff. It's the Latin phrase for high priest. It's just a descriptor of an office, right? It's just like, gosh, it's like when this issue gets brought up, people just lose the ability to make any distinctions. If you read the Vatican II documents about enculturation, it's actually about how culture is transformed by the gospel. It was not about how the liturgy is transformed by contact with pagan religion. The culture is the leaven, and the gospel is like, or wait, what is leaven the yeast? I'm having a brain fart. I'm gonna get them confused. The point is the culture is like what's passive, and the gospel is like the leaven, right? That activates the culture, right? Now we have something completely different. The culture is what's the active ingredient, and the liturgy is what is passively changed. So it's all backwards. This is what you notice whenever these kind of moderns talk about enculturation, is they're not talking about how the gospel changes culture. They're talking about how culture changes the liturgy. And that's entirely backwards. I think the church understands that there will always be elements of culture that influence how we worship, how we think about God. But in the past, this was always a very organic process that happened naturally over very long stretches of time. I mentioned earlier the disappearance of the orans posture and its replacement by praying with hands folded. There was no one time when some bishop or guy or committee decided to say, we need to enculturate German society by changing our posture of prayer so they will, come to mass more or something like that. It's always a strange contradiction when they talk about enculturation, because on the one hand, this is often spoken of as something that happens automatically as the gospel encounters new cultures. It's just supposed to be the process of what we used to call Christianization, the idea of a culture slowly taking on Christian elements, taking gold from Egypt, as St. Augustine called it. The things that are incompatible with Christianity wither away, and Christianity informs the culture, right? This is supposed to be something that happens automatically when the gospel encounters new cultures. But on the other hand, they always speak of it as something that we have to promote, that we have to develop by positive efforts. They laud it. They say this is a grand new step in the move towards enculturation, right? That we have to undertake. Which is it? Is it the natural result of the gospel encountering culture or not? Because if it is, then we shouldn't have to take deliberate efforts to force it to happen. If you want real enculturation, just say the mass and live the gospel in those cultures, and let the culture marinate in the gospel for generations, and see what happens. See what kind of beautiful syntheses you get. That's how you get beautiful things like uh, Irish Catholicism, like Polish Catholicism, like Mexican, like Filipino Catholicism, which is such a rich, interesting expression of Catholicism. These things take centuries to marinate, right? Just let it happen. We don't need to create committees and say, like, we need to increase our enculturation quotient by 30% this quarter. It's just, it's another expression of the bureaucratization of religion overall. And
Mhm.
I'll shut up before I go on and rant about that.
Well, no, Philip, I think, there's this uh, propaganda that gets spread around nowadays that calls traditionalists, well, anything from, well, you people are just going off of like the base passions of low IQ racism or, aestheticism, all of these different things. And I think what you've proved here is that there is a level of intellectual rigor that traditionalists do have. And I think people discount what the you mentioned Dr. Kwasniewski with there's been so much work done recently talking
Yeah.
about the true understanding of Catholic liturgy, and really how we can make sense of this crisis. And this has been a great example of it. Outside of reading your great articles in Catholic Family News, the monthly newspaper, where else can people find your work?
Well, on the blog Unam Sanctam Catholicam, and I should mention, a lot of people don't realize this. There's two Unam Sanctum websites. There's a blog that speaks to more current events and just kind of ruminations, and then I have a website, unamsanctumcatholicam.com, that has much longer essays that are more like evergreen sort of content, more scholarly. That's a great resource. There's a YouTube channel, the Unam Sanctum Catholicam YouTube channel, that I recommend everybody check out and subscribe to. Obviously, the pages of Catholic Family News. I also write a monthly column for Catholic Exchange. And then if you go on just Amazon and look up my name and a lot of my books, you will find a lot of content that I've written. Much of it is aimed for younger people. A lot of my books are known for kind of like texts for middle schoolers and for teaching kids about church history. So there's a lot of stuff there. But you'll find your way around if you just start Googling my name. And you can also follow Unam Sanctum Catholicam on Facebook as well.
Yeah, all great things, great resources. So thank you
You.
so much again for Philip coming on the show, and for all of our audience. May God grant you many joyful years.